Look into the mirror for a moment and think about the color of your eyes. If they happen to be green, you're holding one of the rarest things a human body can produce. Rarer than being left-handed, rarer than being born a twin, rarer than almost any physical trait you can name. Roughly 2 out of every 100 people on this entire planet have green eyes. And here's the part almost no one ever told you. The reason they exist at all is one of the strangest, most improbable accidents in the entire story of human evolution. For decades, scientists assumed they understood how eye color worked. They taught it in classrooms. They printed it in textbooks. Parents used it to guess what their unborn children might look like. And then a group of researchers decided to test that comfortable, tidy explanation against real human DNA, thousands of genomes at a scale nobody had ever attempted before. What they found didn't just poke a hole in the old story, it demolished it. Because green eyes, it turns out, aren't a color at all. There is no green pigment anywhere inside a human eye. None. And once you understand what's actually happening in there, you may never look at another pair of eyes the same way again. Let's start with the thing you were almost certainly taught, because it's so clean, so simple, and so deeply, fundamentally wrong. If you sat in a biology class at any point in the last 100 years, you were probably handed a version of eye color that works like a coin flip. You inherit one eye color gene from your mother and one from your father. Brown is dominant, blue is recessive, and green sits somewhere in the fuzzy middle. Brown beats green beats blue, and the strongest gene wins. It was elegant. It fit perfectly on a classroom whiteboard, right next to Mendel and his famous pea plants. A teacher could explain it in 5 minutes, hand out a little grid, and let a room full of students predict a baby's eye color just by filling in the boxes. 2 blue-eyed parents, blue-eyed child, every time. 1 brown, 1 blue, probably brown. It felt like science working exactly the way science is supposed to work. Neat cause leading to neat effect. There was just one problem with that beautiful little model. It was wrong. Not slightly off, not in need of a small correction. It was wrong at its foundation, structurally wrong in a way that meant the entire picture had to be thrown out and rebuilt from scratch. And the cracks had been showing for a very long time, before anyone was willing to admit what they meant. Think about the situations that quietly broke the rules. 2 brown-eyed parents, following that tidy chart, should almost never produce a blue-eyed child. Brown dominates everything, remember? And yet it happened, over and over, in families all around the world. A mother with warm brown eyes, a father with warm brown eyes, and a baby who opened its eyes to reveal the palest, clearest blue. According to the classroom model, that simply shouldn't be possible, but it was, and it still is, in ordinary families everywhere. Then there were the siblings, children born to the same 2 parents, sharing the same pool of inherited genes, who somehow ended up with completely different eyes. One with deep chestnut brown, one with a soft, shifting hazel, one with cool gray, and one with a striding, unmistakable forest green. The chart couldn't account for that. There was no combination of boxes you could fill in that produced that kind of spread from a single set of parents. For years, geneticists waved these cases away as anomalies, rare exceptions, statistical noise that didn't threaten the underlying rule. An exception here, an oddity there. Nothing to rebuild the whole model over. But anomalies have a way of piling up, and eventually the tools caught up with the questions. When researchers finally sat down and tested the old inheritance model against actual human DNA, scanning thousands upon thousands of genomes and comparing them directly to the eye colors those people actually had, the comfortable story collapsed almost instantly. Because eye color, it turns out, isn't governed by 1 gene. It isn't governed by 2 or even 3. In a landmark large-scale study published in a respected human genetics journal, researchers discovered that as many as 16 different genes contribute to the color of a single human eye. 16, each one nudging the final outcome just slightly. Some adding pigment, some subtracting it, some changing the very way light bounces and scatters inside the eye. This is what scientists mean when they call a trait polygenic, built not from one instruction, but from a whole committee of them, all voting at once. And this is where green becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because if brown or blue can emerge from a range of genetic combinations, green cannot. Green is the product of a very specific, very narrow genetic configuration, a setup that has to line up almost perfectly for the color to appear at all. It's not just one unlucky or lucky roll of the genetic dice. Imagine you had 16 separate dice, and to get green, every single one of them had to land within a tight, particular range at the same moment. That's closer to the truth. Green isn't a single gene misfiring or a simple recessive trait slipping through. It's an entire sequence of independent genetic factors all falling into alignment at once, an outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The best way to picture it is to stop imagining a coin flip entirely and start imagining a control panel. Think of height for a second, because height works the same way. Nobody has a single tall gene. Your height is the cumulative result of dozens of tiny genetic contributions, each one adding or subtracting a fraction, all summed together into the number on the doctor's chart. Eye color works exactly like that. Picture 16 separate dials, each one turned to a slightly different position in every single person on Earth. In one person, the melanin dial is cranked high and the others barely matter, and the result is deep, dark brown. In another, melanin is turned almost all the way down. The light-scattering dials are set just so, and the pigment dial adds a whisper of gold, and out of that precise combination emerges green. Turn any one of those dials even slightly, and the whole outcome shifts, sliding along an enormous continuous spectrum from the darkest brown through amber and hazel and gray all the way to the palest blue. That's the real picture the DNA revealed. Not a handful of clean categories you could sort people into, but a vast, smooth range of possibilities, blended and layered, where every human eye sits at its own unique point along a gradient. And to understand where green falls on that gradient and why it's so rare, you have to start pulling those dials apart one at a time and see what each of them is actually doing. So, let's begin with the most important one of all, the master switch that sets the stage for everything else. A gene sitting quietly on the 15th human chromosome, doing a job that determines just how dark or how light every pair of eyes on the planet will ever be. That gene is called OCA2, and its job is deceptively simple to describe and staggeringly important in practice. OCA2 carries the instructions for building something researchers call the P protein, and the P protein has one central responsibility inside the eye. It governs how much melanin gets deposited into the iris. Melanin is the same pigment that colors your skin and your hair, the same molecule that darkens under summer sun and defines whether hair grows out jet black or sandy blonde. In the iris, it does the exact same thing it does everywhere else in the body. It absorbs light, and the more of it there is, the darker the surface it sits in appears. So, think of OCA2 as the volume knob for pigment. When it's working at full capacity, pumping out plenty of P protein and packing the iris with melanin, the eye drinks in almost all the light that strikes it, and the result is a brown so deep it can look nearly black in a dim room. Dial that production down a little, and you get lighter browns, then the warm mixed tones we call hazel. Dial it down further still, until only the faintest trace of pigment remains, and you arrive at the light end of the spectrum, the greens and the pale blues and the cool grays. OCA2 doesn't decide which of those light colors you land on by itself, but it sets the stage. It determines whether there is enough melanin in the iris to make brown at all, or whether the eye is left mostly empty of pigment, an open canvas waiting for other forces to paint on. And this is the part that surprises people. Whether your eyes are brown or something lighter comes down, in large part, to a single number. How much melanin OCA2 allowed into the front layer of your iris while you were still developing. It really is that fundamental. Everything else, all the subtlety and variation and the strange in-between colors, is built on top of that one baseline decision. But here's the twist that makes the whole system so much stranger than a simple volume knob. OCA2 doesn't set its own volume. It doesn't decide how loud to play. Something else does that for it, something sitting right next door, because immediately adjacent to OCA2 on that same chromosome lies another gene entirely, one called HERC2. And HERC2 is where the real intrigue begins. HERC2 doesn't make any pigment, it doesn't produce melanin, it doesn't build P protein, it doesn't touch the iris directly at all. What it does is far more subtle and, in a way, far more powerful. HERC2 controls how much OCA2 gets turned on in the first place. If OCA2 is the volume knob, Then HERC2 is the hand resting on that knob, deciding how far to turn it. Researchers describe it as acting almost like a dimmer switch. It doesn't generate the light, it regulates it. It sets the ceiling on how much melanin production is even allowed to happen inside those developing eyes. Sit with that arrangement for a second, because it's genuinely elegant. You have one gene whose entire purpose is to make pigment, and right beside it, a second gene whose entire purpose is to tell the first one how hard to work. They function as a pair, a call and response, a switch in the machine the switch controls. And between them, these two genes, OCA2 and HERC2, explain almost everything about why your eyes look the way they do. Not 16 genes fighting for equal say, but two dominant players setting the fundamental brightness of the whole picture, with the other genes tuning the details around the edges. If you understand OCA2 and HERC2, you understand the backbone of human eye color. But even that isn't the strangest part. Because in 2008, a team of researchers went looking inside HERC2 to find out exactly how it flips that dimmer switch, and what they discovered rewrote the story yet again. Buried deep inside the HERC2 gene, in a stretch of DNA that scientists label intron 86, a region that doesn't even code for a protein, they found a single genetic letter with an influence wildly out of proportion to its size. Just one letter. In the four-letter alphabet of DNA, the A, the T, the C, and the G that spell out every living thing, one single position in the sequence turned out to be doing an astonishing amount of work. Geneticists gave it a name that sounds like a locker combination: RS129138332. It's what's called an SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is just the technical term for a spot in the genome where one letter can vary from person to person. And at this particular spot, the letter is either a T or a C. That's the entire difference. One letter swapped for another in a region of the gene that doesn't build anything at all. And yet that swap correlates so strongly with eye color that researchers found they could predict from that single position alone whether a person had brown eyes or blue eyes, and do it with startling accuracy. Not a rough guess, not a slight lean one way or the other, a prediction reliable enough to feel almost unnerving. Stop and consider the scale of that for a moment. Your genome contains roughly 3 billion of these letters, 3 billion rungs on the twisting ladder of your DNA, an amount of information so vast it's difficult to hold in the mind. And out of all 3 billion, this single letter tucked away in a non-coding corner of a gene most people will never hear of, plays an outsized role in something as visible and personal as the color of your eyes. It's one of the clearest, cleanest examples biologists have ever found of how a tiny change in DNA, the smallest possible edit, a single character rewritten, can ripple upward into a massive, obvious, physical difference that anyone can see across a room. But even here, at this beautifully simple switch, the biology refuses to stay simple, because that single letter doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's yet another layer sitting on top of it, another gene quietly interfering with the outcome, adjusting the volume even after HERC2 has set it. And it's that hidden layer, sitting right back inside OCA2 itself, that explains why two people with what looks like the exact same genetic switch can still end up with eyes that don't quite match. That extra layer is what geneticists call a penetrance modifier, and the name captures exactly what it does. Penetrance, in genetics, refers to how fully a particular genetic instruction actually shows up in the body. A gene can carry a command, but whether that command gets executed loudly, quietly, or somewhere in between depends on the other machinery around it. And buried within OCA2, the very melanin-controlling gene we already met, there sits a separate coding variant whose entire job seems to be to strengthen or soften the effect of that HERC2 switch. It doesn't set the dimmer itself. It leans on the dimmer after the fact, nudging it up or holding it back, quietly deciding how much of HERC2's instruction actually lands. Think about what that means in practice. You could take two people, look at their DNA, and find that at RS129138332, they carry the exact same genotype, the identical pair of letters in that famous little switch. By the tidy logic of the old model, they should have matching eyes. And yet, because of this second variant sitting nearby in OCA2, one of them might end up with a clear, cool blue, while the other lands on a muted greenish gray, or a blue so deep it edges towards slate. Same switch, different outcome. The difference isn't in the switch at all, it's in the hand that's resting on the volume knob just off to the side, turning it a fraction of a degree that the switch itself never accounts for. This is the kind of layered, interlocking complexity that made the old classroom story so hopelessly misleading. It wasn't just that the textbook missed a gene or two, it's that the entire architecture of how eye color gets built is nothing like a single dominant trait beating a single recessive one. It's a conversation. It's OCA2 deciding how much pigment to make, HERC2 deciding how loudly OCA2 gets to speak, a single letter in intron 86 setting the baseline for that volume, and then yet another variant reaching back in to fine-tune the whole thing. Layers on top of layers, each one adjusting the last, and all of it happening silently in a few cells at the front of your eye before you were even born. And here is where the story takes its strangest turn yet. Because everything we've talked about so far, this entire elegant system of melanin and dimmer switches and penetrance modifiers, does a brilliant job of explaining one thing above all others: brown versus blue. That HERC2 switch, more melanin or less melanin, dark iris or light iris, that's the axis it governs. Turn the dial up, you get brown. Turn it down, you get blue. It's clean, it's satisfying. It accounts for the two most common eye colors on Earth almost entirely on its own. But it does not, on its own, explain green. Green is not simply a stop somewhere along the melanin dial. You can't produce green just by turning the pigment down a little less than you would for blue, or a little more than you would for hazel. Green requires something extra, an additional layer of biology that goes beyond the simple question of how much melanin gets deposited in the iris. It sits outside the brown to blue spectrum in a way that stumped researchers for a long time, because they kept trying to explain it with pigment alone, and pigment alone kept coming up short. To actually understand where green comes from, you have to do something almost counterintuitive. You have to stop thinking about eye color as a matter of pigment at all, at least not entirely, and start thinking about it as a combination of pigment and physics. Because the truth about green eyes, the fact that catches nearly everyone off guard when they first hear it, is this: there is no green pigment in the human eye. None. There is no green molecule sitting in your iris. There is no substance in there tinted the color of moss or emerald or sea glass. No matter how vividly, how unmistakably green a person's eyes appear, no matter how much they seem to glow that color in sunlight, there is not a single speck of green pigment anywhere in the tissue producing that effect. Let that settle for a second, because it genuinely upends the intuition most of us carry. We assume that a green thing is green because it contains something green, the way a red apple contains red pigment, or a leaf contains chlorophyll. Your eyes break that rule completely. The green you see when you look at green eyes is not a pigment you're looking at. It's something the eye is doing to light. It's an illusion assembled from structure and scattering. And once you understand how it's built, the entire spectrum of human eye color, every hazel, every amber, every impossible shade of gray, suddenly makes a kind of sense it never did before. To see how, you have to look at how the iris is actually layered. The front portion of the iris, the part facing outward, the part you're looking at when you meet someone's gaze, is called the stroma. And the stroma is not some solid wall of color. It's a loose, semi-transparent mesh of collagen fibers, structural proteins woven together, threaded through with only a small amount of a pale yellowish pigment. That yellow pigment has a name of its own, lipochrome, and it's going to matter enormously in a moment. But first, the collagen. Because when light enters the eye and strikes that fine mesh of stromal fibers, something happens to it that has almost nothing to do with pigment, and almost everything to do with the physics of how light behaves when it scatters off tiny structures. When light hits those microscopic collagen fibers, the shorter wavelengths, the blues, scatter more easily than the longer wavelengths, the reds and oranges. So, more blue light bounces back out of the eye toward the observer. This is called Rayleigh scattering. And if the name sounds familiar, it should, because it is remarkably similar to the reason the sky appears blue. The sky isn't blue because there's blue paint spread across it. It's blue because sunlight scatters off molecules in the atmosphere, and the blue wavelengths scatter most. Your eyes, astonishingly, are doing a smaller, more intimate version of the exact same trick. A blue iris is not a blue pigmented iris. It's a nearly colorless stroma with very little melanin behind it, scattering light back at you in a way your brain reads as blue. Now, bring the lipochrome back into the picture. Layer that structural blue, produced entirely by scattering, underneath a thin veil of yellowish pigment sitting in the stroma. What happens? The same thing that happens on an artist's palette when a brush of blue drags through a smear of yellow. They blend. They combine into green. That is the whole secret. Green eyes are structural blue light, scattered off collagen, viewed through a soft wash of yellow lipochrome. Blue physics plus yellow pigment equals green perception, and there is not one molecule of green anywhere in the equation. And once you see it that way, the entire spectrum of human eye color stops being a set of separate boxes and becomes a single continuous dial. Nudge the amount of lipochrome up, add a touch more melanin, and the green warms toward amber or hazel. Pull the pigment back, thin out the yellow, and the same eye drifts toward a blue so pale it reads almost gray in certain light. Change the ratio by the smallest degree, and you slide along an enormous, unbroken range of shades. This is why eye color was never a coin flip, never a tidy set of dominant and recessive outcomes. It's an interplay, a negotiation between three forces at once. How much melanin the OCA2 and HERC2 machinery allows into the iris, how much yellow lipochrome is present, and how the stroma scatters light. Turn all 16 of those genetic dials in slightly different positions in every single person, and you get a spectrum as individual as a fingerprint. It also explains something people with hazel eyes have insisted on for their whole lives, often to skeptical friends who assume they're imagining it. Hazel eyes really do seem to shift color depending on the light, the surroundings, even the clothing someone's wearing. That's not your imagination, and it's not vanity. It's variable melanin distribution across the iris combined with that same light scattering effect. So, different lighting genuinely emphasizes different components of the blend. The gold or amber ring that some people have around their pupils, a phenomenon called central heterochromia, is another expression of the same underlying physics. Melanin clustered unevenly, catching the light differently at the center than at the edge. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn of all, because you might assume that a trait this delicate, this specific, this dependent on so many genes lining up just right, must be ancient. Something that's been drifting through human populations for tens of thousands of years. Ancient DNA said otherwise, and it overturned an assumption almost everyone held. When researchers sequenced the remains of early Europeans, they found something they weren't prepared for. Most of those early Europeans had dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes, and they kept that combination right up until roughly 3,000 years ago. Light eyes, light skin, the whole pale pigmentation pathway that green eyes belong to is remarkably, almost shockingly recent. And 3,000 years is nothing on an evolutionary timescale. It's a blink. The trail leads toward the region surrounding the Caucasus Mountains, that ancient land bridge between Europe and Asia, and slightly further east toward southern Siberia, where Bronze Age remains over 4,000 years old, carry the earliest hints of the variant. From there, it rode outward on the Great Steppe migrations, then concentrated through the founder effect and genetic drift, growing especially common within Celtic and Nordic lineages. That's the reason Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia carry such high rates of green eyes today. It's a direct genetic echo of ancient migration routes, written into the faces of living people. And green remains the rarest naturally occurring eye color on Earth, roughly 2% of everyone alive, against brown's 70 to 79% and blue's 8 to 10. Yet green-eyed people turn up in nearly every region of the world, a genetic fingerprint left behind by centuries of migration, trade, conquest, and mixing. There's even a practical footnote worth knowing. Because green irises carry less protective melanin, they come with a somewhat elevated risk of certain sun-related eye conditions, including a rare cancer called uveal melanoma, which is a genuinely good reason to take UV protection seriously and wear proper sunglasses. So, the coin flip you were taught was never real. Green eyes are physics wearing the mask of pigment, an ancient migration written in light. Now, I want to hear from you. If you have green eyes, where did your family come from? And did, knowing there's no green pigment in there at all, change how you see them? Tell me in the comments. Before you answer, let me leave you with a few details that make this whole story sit even stranger in the mind. Because the more you understand about what's happening inside a green iris, the more remarkable it becomes that you can see it at all. Consider this. Every color your eye produces is being assembled in real time, right now, as light pours into you. There is no stored green waiting there like paint in a can. The moment the light stops, the color effectively stops being generated. What you're looking at when you look into someone's green eyes isn't a fixed object at all. It's an event. A continuous flickering collaboration between collagen fibers, a thin wash of yellow pigment, and whatever light happens to be falling in that instant. Move that person under a warm lamp, and the green deepens toward amber. Take them outside under a gray overcast sky, and it cools toward a mossy forested tone. Same eye, same genes, different physics. And that instability is exactly why photographs so often fail to capture green eyes properly. People with green eyes tend to complain that cameras never get it right, that their eyes look brown in one shot and gray in the next, and only occasionally show the color they actually see in the mirror. That's not a flaw in the camera, it's the honest truth of the trait. A green eye is a moving target because it depends on the angle and quality of the light striking that scattering layer. You are not photographing a color, you are photographing a condition that happens to be producing a color at that particular moment. Here's another detail that surprised even the researchers combing through the genetic data. The same narrow configuration that produces green is astonishingly easy to nudge off course. A slightly higher deposit of melanin in the front layer, and the green tips into hazel. A little less lipochrome, and it drifts toward that pale, almost gray blue. This is why full siblings, drawing from the exact same parental gene pool, can end up scattered across the spectrum. One with deep forest green, another with cool gray, a third with warm hazel that shifts by the hour. They weren't dealt different cards from different decks. They were dealt tiny variations from the same deck. And with 16 dials all in play, tiny variations are enough to produce visibly different faces at the same dinner table. And think about what that means for the founder communities where green eyes concentrated. In a small population moving across the Bronze Age steppe, carrying a rare variant, marrying largely within the group, that improbable genetic configuration got copied forward until it stopped being an accident and started being a signature. The green eyes of a village in the highlands of Scotland or the fjords of Norway are, in a very literal sense, a fossil of a migration that happened before writing reached those places. Every green-eyed child born there is carrying a sequence that first flickered into existence beside a mountain range thousands of miles away. In people who never knew the ocean, those descendants would eventually stand beside. There's one more thing worth sitting with. Because green eyes are so recent and so rare, they have never had time to become common enough for evolution to smooth them into something stable and predictable. They exist right at the frontier of human variation, a trait still in motion, still spreading, still mixing into new populations, wherever people travel and settle and fall in love across old boundaries. In a strange way, a green-eyed person is standing at the leading edge of one of the youngest visible changes in our entire species. Not an ancient inheritance at all, but one of the newest paint strokes on the human face, and one still being applied. So, the tidy chart on the classroom wall didn't just simplify the truth. It buried a story far more astonishing than the fiction it replaced. No single gene, no coin flip, no green pigment anywhere. Instead, 16 genetic dials, a layer of collagen scattering light the same way the sky does, a whisper of yellow, and an ancient migration echoing quietly in the eyes of people who have no idea they're carrying it. Now, I really want to hear from you. If your eyes shift color depending on the light, when do they look the greenest to you? And has anyone ever argued with you about what color they actually are? And if you don't have green eyes yourself, do you know someone whose eyes seem to change with their mood or the weather? Tell me your stories down in the comments, because I read them, and the strangest ones always turn into the next video.